something. Great to be a Queenslander.
Well, it certainly is great to be a Queenslander, especially when we're beating the Blues. But rugby league hasn't always been the high-profile professional sport that we've grown to love, but it's always been a very important part of the Sunshine State and has produced countless memories along the way. So sit back and relax as Paul Vorton and I take you through a nostalgic rollercoaster ride of the golden years of Queensland Rugby League.
Champion, what's doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Mate, do you get any idea where the first serious game of rugby league was played?
It was either Normanton or Thargomindah.
No, it wasn't. It was here in Brisbane. It was at the Ekka. Yeah, the boys did very well. Actually, they were two rugby union sides that converted to the 13-man-a-side game. Yeah. They put on a bit of a show out there. One was naturally called Queensland. The others, well, they were the Kiwis, the New Zealand team that were returning from a tour of England. They did pretty well there. So the boys decided, we'll whack one on here.
They tell me that Queensland had 3 coaches and one of them actually refereed.
That's him, W. Beattie. He was the man with the whistle.
Bustling Billy, Barry or Bob, which was it?
He could have been any. They didn't list his first name in there. They just said a W. Beattie. But he didn't do a real good job for Queensland on that afternoon. In fact, we got beaten on the day and had to turn to a southern influence to get us home in a couple of years.
Fair dinkum.
After going down 34-12 in that first game to the Kiwis, Queensland imported the legendary Dally Messenger. And didn't he make a difference? The Maroons drew the second game with the Kiwis 12-all. Messenger scored 9 of the 12 points. In May 1909, the Brisbane club competition kicked off, and the same year the game got going in the country with clubs in Bundaberg and North Queensland. In Queensland, the foundation of what was to become the greatest game of all were firmly set by men such as Jack Bahili. Well, Fatty, strangely, it was the First World War that gave rugby league the opportunity to become the dominant football code in Queensland.
But what did the war have to do with it, Wally? Because surely both union and league were affected with the young players enlisting.
Yeah, they were, but I mean, rugby union almost died off completely, and that gave the chance for the fans and the public to become involved in rugby league. The immediate post-war period also saw one of the game's great early administrators take control in Queensland, Harry Sunderland. He was not only the secretary of the QRL, but was also a league reporter and coach and manager of the Australian and Queensland representative sides. He even took out a personal mortgage to build a grandstand at Davies Park so Brisbane could host international games against New Zealand. Well, by the 1920s, club football had established itself in Queensland and the interstate battles were on in earnest. But after a few early hidings, the Maroons entered a period of domination over the Blues, thanks mainly to a world-class side from Toowoomba. This rare footage from the Sydney Showground in 1924 sees Jimmy Craig leading the Maroons into battle against the Blues. Amongst the Queenslanders were such legends as Tommy Gorman, Duncan Thompson and 2 of the early hardmen, Vic Armbruster and Herb Steinort. Steinort was not big by today's standards, but from all reports, he really hurt. Of course, his tackling style may not have passed the referee's scrutiny today. The Toowoomba side of the mid-20s was so good it beat all comers for 2 years, including New South Wales, England, New Zealand and the Sydney Premiers as well as Ipswich and Brisbane. Toowoomba was undefeated in 13 games, scoring an amazing 323 points and conceding only 136.
Well, from what I've read, Wally, there were some great clashes during the 20s and 30s. The club competition was very strong. The Balima Cup was thriving, that being a 3-team comp between Toowoomba, Ipswich and Brisbane, and they're up to 4 interstate clashes a year between Queensland and the Blues.
In fact, the legendary English fullback Jim Sullivan led the Poms on one of the toughest ever test series against Australia around about that time. In this, the first test at the SCG, the Poms won 8-6. Australia was led by Toowoomba's tough tackling Herb Steinort. In fact, over half the team came from Queensland, amongst them Dan Dempsey, Mick Madsen and Hack G. The second test was such a torrid game it became known as the Battle of Brisbane. Players kept dropping like flies and at one stage we were down to 11 men, but we got home 15 points to 6. The match was a good example of the role that Harry Sunderland played in rugby league at the time. He was coach and manager of the Australian side and then wrote the match report in the next day's Courier Mail.
Novel approach, that one, Wally. Good chance for old Harry to give himself a rap.
Yeah, I'm sure Wayne Bennett would like to be able to write his match reports the next day. But despite having 8 Queenslanders in their side, our boys went down 18-13 in the decider. The early 30s and Australia was in the grip of the Great Depression and sport, well, it was a means of forgetting your woes just for a while. Football was a great attraction and the interstate clashes attracted big crowds. The Maroons served it up to the Blues early in the decade. But the boys from the south, well, they really turned it around against Queensland from 1935 on. So much so, we had only 2 reps picked for the first test against Jim Bruff's touring Pommy side in 36. One of them was the great Vic Hay, who had been lured north of the border to Toowoomba. And seen here, setting up a try for the immortal Dave Brown. Another was Les Monty Heidke, who had recovered from the near-crippling leg injury that robbed him touring with the 1933-34 Kangaroos. Heidke, number 4, sets this try for Ridley, who romped home 24 points to 8. In the second test here at the Gabba, a runaway try by Archie Crippen wasn't enough to hold out the Poms, who won 12-7. For the decider in Sydney, Toowoomba's tough prop Mick Madsen was brought into the side, playing out of position to try and solve the scrummaging problems. Also elevated was Toowoomba's halfback Freddie Gilbert. It was the day that tough men Ray Steer and John Arkwright got their marching orders. Vic Hay scored the only try for Australia, but it wasn't enough. The tourists clinching the Ashes, winning again 12-7.
Wally, once again, I suppose the war interrupted a lot of good young rugby league careers.
Yeah, despite the war looming in Europe at that stage, the Kangaroos went back there in 1937. They had 7 Queenslanders in the side, and the vice-captain was the very famous Jack Reardon. In this, the first test at Leeds, the Kangaroos were beaten a point, 5-4. The home side repeated the dose in the second test, but Australia salvaged some pride by taking the third 13-3, with Reardon amongst the try scorers. Despite his playing career being severely affected by the war, Jack stayed a household name in Queensland football by continuing to write for the Courier Mail until the late 70s. On the interstate front, New South Wales were virtually invincible in the latter part of the 30s. There were occasions for Queenslanders to cheer about. Freddie Gilbert scoring here remained a force. Ipswich's Cole Wright always knew where the line was, and Jack Barnes was a prolific try scorer. The Queensland defence was fierce. In 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland finally sparked the much-feared Second World War, and our troops were called into action. It was also in 1939 that New South Wales' dominance of the Interstate Series was finally broken. The Blues won the first 2 matches in Sydney, but Queensland retaliated by winning the last 2 in Brisbane. And the following year, the Maroons were triumphant, winning 3 of the 4 games. Just some of the stars for Queensland were Jack Reardon, Les Heidke and Captain Edward the Babe Collins, seen here crashing over for a try. Flashy winger Eric Harris got into the act with this try at the SCG. After the 1941 series, interstate games were suspended for the duration of the war. The end of the war signalled the beginning of the new rivalry in interstate football, and didn't everyone relish getting their minds off fighting and back to some good old rugby league. The Duke of Gloucester was present for the resumption of the interstate series at the SCG. Played in front of 54,000 football-hungry fans, the Maroons went down to a convincing Blues side 37-12, with fullback Don O'Connor coming in for some harsh treatment. The return clash in Brisbane also yielded victory for New South Wales. In a bleak 1946, Valley's Roy Westaway provided one of only a few exciting moments as far as Queensland was concerned.
Here Thornton gets the ball to Westaway, who charges over for a try.
The same year saw the eagerly awaited resumption of Test football against the old enemy. Gus Risman led his side into battle against Australia in the first Test at the SCG. Westaway and Queensland colleagues John Grice and Reg Kay also made the team, and the match ended in an 8-all draw. The second Test, well, it was played in Brisbane, and you can just see how hungry we were for rugby league. The gates were closed 3 hours before kick-off. A crowd of 40,000 was posted, but must surely have well exceeded that when fans stampeded their way into the ground and then onto the playing surface at the Ekka. Lionel Cooper brought the crowd to its feet when he dived over in the corner for Australia. But the all-powerful Englishman proved too strong in the end to win 14-5. The Poms later clinched the Ashes by winning the third Test 20-7, with Reg Kay the lone Queensland representative.
So Queenslanders doing it tough in the selection stakes just didn't happen in our day.
Paul, it seems that Queenslanders always had to prove that little bit extra before they get the nod. In 1948, a 2-test series was played against New Zealand. In the first Test, an inexperienced Australian side, led by Len Smith, went down to the Kiwis 21-19. Queensland had just 4 representatives all making their debuts, one of them Bill Tyquin. Despite having his career interrupted by the war, Tyquin went on to achieve great things in club, interstate and international football. In the second Test in Brisbane, Valley's prop, the great Duncan Hall, made his debut. Australia won 13-4. Hall's performance was such that it gained him a berth in the 1948 Kangaroo side. But back in those days, there seemed to be some contentious selection criteria. They say it was the Catholic versus the Masons. The big hullabaloo came when the Australian and New South Wales skipper Len Smith was overlooked to captain the 48 Kangaroos. Not only that, he didn't even get a Guernsey. But was it because he was a Catholic?
At the time they were blaming the religion, you know. And when I come to be picked as vice captain, I was the same religion. So that picks me up too.
And while Clive Churchill gained his first kangaroo jumper on this tour, there were some controversial omissions. 3 prominent Queenslanders in O'Connor, Rooney and McLennan, well, they were all left out. But big Duncan Hall remembers the lead-up game against Castleford.
Castleford's side run out, and the blokes there were smashed noses and big cauliflower ears and that, and you know, they were lined up there, and the bloke next to me nudged me, he said, I said, look at them. He said, oh, don't worry about them. He said, they're only the backs. He said, you wait till they bring the forwards out. He said, they bring them out in the cage.
The Poms won the first test 23-21. At one stage, Australia trailed 17-6 and then turned on a superb late rally, only going down by just 2 points. Toowoomba's Pat McMahon scoring 2 tries, England clinching the Ashes by winning the second test 16-7. So to the third test at Bradford, and Bill Tyquin, seen here leading out the Australian side, assumed the captaincy role over the injured Maxwell. The Kangaroos were right in the thick of it for most of the match before going down 23-9. The Bulimba Cup kicked off after the war, and in the early 1950s it produced some great games and big crowds.
If you played club football, it was the ultimate to represent your city in Bulimba Cup. We thought that was the ultimate, and that's where we finished. Some were lucky and fortunate enough to go on and reach higher honours.
Ernest Ward and his Great Britain side of 1950 arrived in Australia with great anticipation. It would be a test series that would end in extraordinary circumstances. Our big mate Duncan Hall was joined in the pack by South Brisbane's Alan Thompson for the first test. And what a struggle. Australia going down 6-4 in the wet conditions. The return bout in Brisbane, well, it was a different story. Dennis Flannery made his test debut on the wing, as did Mackay's Ned Andrews in the centres. Australia turned it around by winning 15-3 to set up a thrilling third test decider. But for Flannery, it was a day of mixed fortunes. Australia had won, but the winger's honesty in ruling himself out through injury for the third test would turn out to be fateful. His place would be taken by St George's Ron Roberts. Such was the hype for the decider in Sydney that the gates were opened at 7 a.m, and by kick-off it was jam-packed. Torrential rain had fallen all week and the pitch was a quagmire. The match reached fever pitch 15 minutes before full time, when none other than Ron Roberts broke a 2-all deadlock to race his way over in the corner. Australia had won the third test 5-2 and the Ashes for the first time in 30 years. Hats went everywhere and grown men wept as the little master, Clive Churchill, was chaired from the field, caked in mud, in one of rugby league's finest hours.
I'll never forget Ronnie Roberts going in. He had a couple of, well, it was very, very slippery ball and that, and he mishandled a couple of times, but as did everyone else on the field. And we caught the right one, and we scored in the corner, which gave us the game. And I'll treasure in my memory for the rest of my days, sort of thing. And everyone's performance, that was never a bad player.
The early 50s also saw one of the great entertaining sides of post-war rugby league come to Australia, the French. But things didn't start out too well, and they nearly didn't get the chance to show just how good an attacking side they were. Brian Davies, who made his debut in the first test, recalls how poorly the tourists performed in the lead-up matches.
Old Jersey Flegg was the chairman of the Australian Rugby League, and he read the riot act to them. He said he'd send them home if they didn't improve, and boy, did they improve.
Did they what? Before a record crowd of 60,000 people, the Froggies scored one of the greatest upsets in rugby league history, beating Australia 26-15. South Brisbane's Harold Croker scored one of Australia's 3 tries, and check out big Duncan Hall as he throws his weight around. But it didn't matter on the day. That great chain-smoking fullback and goal-kicking skipper Puy Albert and his men were entertaining, to say the least. For the second test, the selectors turned to Queensland, selecting 7 Maroons in the side, the most in an Australian side since 1932. And what a difference it made. We won 23-11. The decider, however, in Sydney was another shock. Australia was simply overwhelmed, 7 tries to 2, Albert landing 7 goals. The French tore our defence to shreds, winning 35-14. Duncan Hall and Brian Davies were Australia's try scorers that day, but Davies got a dressing down after this French try by El Brousset.
Giant French forward Bruce is bullocking his way through to score on the post. Australian forward Davis chasing him, knocks him out. Referee McMahon, remembering the Brisbane Test warfare, hands out an immediate caution.
Brian Davies went on to become one of Australia's greats and was also one of the forefathers of the famous Queensland spirit that is still alive today.
When you pull on that maroon jumper, it just does something to you, and I'm sure New South Wales players are the same. But as soon as you get out on that field, you die for Queensland. It's a feeling that you can't explain. And it's the same when you play for Australia. It's just one of those things that it's great to be a Queenslander.
Queensland won the Interstate Series in 1951 for the first time since 1940. And that special feeling of pulling on the maroon jumper here at the Cauldron, Lang Park, you can understand why it feels so great to be a Queenslander. New Zealand toured our shores in 1952, and another massive crowd in excess of 56,000 was on hand here at the SCG for the first test. Ipswich's speedy winger Dennis Flannery scored 2 tries. We won 25-13, but were later flogged in the second test, with the Kiwis also winning the third to clinch the series. The critics said the 1952 Kangaroo side bound for England was one of the weakest ever. But with Clive Churchill and Duncan Hall in command, the Kangaroos did better than most expected. They lost the Ashes 2-1, winning the infamous third test known as the Battle of Bradford. Mate, what about that farcical tour of the Yankee gridiron team that came out to play rugby league in 1953?
That's right, King. There was plenty of hype about it. Can you believe that 65,000 people turned up at the SCG to watch the American All-Stars strut their stuff? Look, the bottom line is they couldn't play and they got hammered all over the park.
And check this out for atrocious ground conditions. The Kiwis were obviously at home in the slush in the second test at Wellington that year. And the Aussies had plenty to gripe about. We went down by a point, decided by this goal.
And Wally, what about these touchies? If that was a goal, fair dinkum, I'm not the fat man. Even the referee reckoned it was wide.
1954, and Dick Williams led the Poms on a tour down under, and Queenslanders had a ball in the first test. Kel O'Shea from Ayr scored a try early in his test debut.
On the run here is Kelvin O'Shea, who goes in up towards the Paddington end, touching down.
Ken McCaffrey, playing with the Toowoomba side at the time, crossed the line twice.
It's gone from Holman to Banks to McCaffrey, and McCaffrey sidestepping out of several half-hearted attempts of tackles, goes in to score a try down towards
and the mighty Duncan Hall broke the game open with this barging try. Churchill's men won 37-12. The return bout at the Gabba gave us our first look at the all-conquering British winger Billy Boston, and what an impact he made. His 2 tries enabling Britain to bounce back and win 38-21. The decider in Sydney was an enthralling encounter. Australia recovered from an 8-0 deficit to win 20 points to 16 and win the Ashes. Brisbane West Alec Watson was a try scorer that day. The French were back in 1955 and they again proved inconsistent but crowd-pleasing, and when it mattered most, triumphant. It all came down to the third test. Brian Davies' try here wasn't enough to secure a victory for the Aussies, who went down fighting 8-5 to the Jacques Mackay-led French. The following year saw a 3-test series against New Zealand. Tom Tyquin, brother of Bill, made his test debut along with fullback Ken McCrowan and Rockhampton's Cyril Connell at 5'8" alongside Keith Holman. Australia won an international series 3-0 for the first time. In 1956, Ken Carney, who led St George to the first of their 11 straight premiership victories, captained the 9th Kangaroos. It wasn't a winner. We were soundly beaten in the first and third tests, 21-10 and 19-0, but came out on top in the second in the mud at Bradford's Obsal Stadium. But by 1957, the gap had widened between New South Wales and Queensland in the Interstate Series. The exodus of our players had begun. The big money offered by millionaire clubs like Saints and West was so tempting. Queensland clubs, well, they weren't in the hunt. There were massive score lines in the 4 interstate matches, all in favour of New South Wales. The 69 points scored by the Blues here in the third encounter remains the all-time high scored in an interstate match. That year, Australia hosted the second World Cup, featuring Great Britain, France and New Zealand. The Aussies won the Cup, not losing a game along the way. At the time, Brian Carlson was captain-coach of Blackall in Queensland when he was selected for the World Cup. And would you believe that Carlson was sacked by the Blackall club when he chose to play in the World Cup over his club commitments? Well, guess who had the last laugh? Carlson not only made his mark in that wonderful series, but would later gain legendary status. Well, Paul, just how good was Brian Davies?
Well, he's what legends are made of, Wally, up here in Queensland, because he made his Test debut in 51, then 7 years later in 58. He was still in the Australian side, this time as captain against Alan Prescott's Great Britain side, and he was Queensland's only rep. New South Wales dominance of the Interstate Series made it hard for a Queenslander to get a Guernsey. That Test series was one to remember. We blitzed them 25 points to 8 in the first Test in Sydney. Kel O'Shea, now with Western Sydney, was one of the try scorers, as was Brian Carlson, now at North Sydney. 34,000 turned up at the Ekka for the second Test, with Queensland Rugby League celebrating its Jubilee year. It was one of the most dramatic tests of all. It was the match where skipper Prescott broke his arm minutes into the match and played on, refusing doctors' pleas to come off. It was the first time we got a chance to see the wild bull of the Pampas, Vince Corralius, in action.
He was a rough looking character. He could order a few houses, I reckon. He was belting our blokes, and our blokes were retaliating. They forgot about football, and the Poms played football and beat us.
Australia made a valiant bid for victory.
It's picked up by O'Shea, who sends out here to Holman, who's moving at full speed to Carlson. Carter's moving inside. They've drawn the defence, but Carlson follows the white line all the way here. And the
Great Britain wouldn't be denied. The turning point came when Coralius set up a try for the brilliant Alex Murphy. The tourists getting home 25-18. The Aussies were understandably confident going into the decider. Prescott, Bolton and Challoner out with injury. But their replacements were up to the task. In fact, it was a romp for Great Britain. 40 points to 17 the scoreline, with Sullivan crossing for 3 tries. Those 1958 Lions had won the Ashes on Australian turf for the first time in 12 years. You know, they're still talking about that series in 58. I was out at dinner the other night, some people just talking about the 58 series. That's all they wanted to talk about. Fantastic. You know, Clive Churchill, greatest player to have played in his day, well, he left the South Sydney club at that stage of his career, a very nasty split, ended up coming up here and playing for Brisbane North.
Yeah, he did, and Queensland, they were about to go on the end of 9 straight losses to New South Wales, but the little master, well, he was about to change all that.
He masterminded the Maroons to a decisive 3-1 series victory over the Blues. What a turnaround. Cliff Johnson led New Zealand to Australia that year, and with our big success in the Interstate Series, we finally saw a new generation of stars emerge. Making their Test debuts were Noel Kelly and Dud Beattie from Ipswich, Barry Muir from Brisbane West, and from St George in Sydney, none other than Johnny Raper and Reg Gasnier. It was a struggle in the wet, Australia getting home by a point. Brian Carlson landed 3 goals, and what a debut for Dud.
It was a shocking day. It was a very cold day. And I remember it because it's the only Test that I've ever scored a try in. It was a planned move with Provan and myself. He was supposed to go wide and I was to go straight through, and they just planned it and we scored. No worries.
In Brisbane, we got our first look at Puff the Magic Dragon, and didn't he turn it on? Running in 3 tries as Australia clinched the series. Another triumph for coach Churchill, and he was soon to be further honoured by coaching the luckless 1959 Kangaroos.
There were 7 Queenslanders selected in that touring side, but there was plenty of flack about the omission of Cunnamulla's Bobby Banks. That first Test, it belonged to Reg Gasnier, Australia winning 22-14.
Muir. Oh, well taken, Gasnier. Oh, well taken, Gasnier, and running clearly, and running brilliantly for a try.
But the second Test at Leeds is remembered as the one that got away. Barry Muir went over for what seemed a fair try, but referee Gelder disallowed it.
And there's an overlap on the far side. Gasnier. And no taken by Carlson, but it's a forward pass. It's a forward pass, it's no good, it's forward pass.
With Australia leading 10-6, Carlson had this conversion of his own try from 20 metres out, only to hit the uprights.
And how disgusted Brian Carlson is of that. There.
A controversial try to Great Britain near the end saw the home side win 11-10. Great Britain later sealed the Ashes by taking the third Test 18-12.
To the swinging 60s, and the heralding of the new decade produced a terrific interstate series, drawn 2-all. The first 2 matches being sensationally tight encounters. The touring Frenchmen started off in roller coaster fashion, losing their first 4 games leading up to the first Test, where they shocked everybody. With 5 Queenslanders in the forward pack, we could only manage a draw 8-all. The return clash in Brisbane was a different story, Australia walloping the Froggies 56-6. But what a turnaround in Sydney. In a tough tussle, the French upset the home side 7-5. That series marked the test debut of the first Aboriginal player, Winnamanly's Lionel Morgan, a powerful winger racing away here for what turned out to be a disallowed try in the decider in Sydney. For Morgan, his selection was the piece de resistance.
It was a great thrill. I didn't realise that I was the first Aboriginal, but I'd set my goals to try to make a name in rugby league for myself, and when that came up, I think that was the pinnacle of a career.
Brisbane Norths won their second of what would be 6 competitions in a row. Bob Bax had taken over the reins as coach.
A fella called Cappy Ricks, who was secretary of Norths in 1960, he came to me and he said, listen, there's a funny thing existing at the moment, Bob. And I said, what's that, Cappy? He said, well, you're a coach without a club and we're a club without a coach. Churchill's not coming back. So and I've been there ever since.
The highlight for Queenslanders in 1961 was the much-awaited opening of the Frank Burke Grandstand at Lang Park by the Queensland Governor, Sir Henry Abel Smith. 1962, and Reg Gasnier became Australia's youngest skipper when he led his side into battle against Eric Ashton's Great Britain side. Forcing his way into the Australian side for the first time was Townsville's Bob Hagan to partner Gasnier in the centres. To our discomfort, the tourists walloped us 31-12.
And then, Fatty, Lang Park hosted its first ever test match between Australia and England, with over 34,000 turning up with great anticipation.
Yeah, Wally, but that big unit Billy Boston put paid to our hopes. And guess what? Ex-Sports Minister Big Mick Vevers made his test debut in that match. He too found Boston virtually unstoppable.
I thought I had him. I thought, I'm going to splatter this bloke into that grandstand and I'll be a champion. I just started to go near him and he started to go away from me, and there was nowhere for him to go, but he was still going away. And I thought, no, a bit of a lunge, miss. But I had the satisfaction of knowing that he had, after he ran past me, he put one foot on the late Ken Irvine's toe, one on his belly, and ran off the top of his head, and then ran over the Keith Barnes, and Keith would remember that too.
Billy Boy's 2 tries that day helped the tourists win 17-10 and clinch the series. It may have been a dead rubber, but the third test turned out to be one of the most thrilling of all test matches, albeit controversial. Frank Drake from Brisbane South, playing in his second test, scored this sensational first try. Tough Ipswich front rower Dud Beattie battled on with rib and shoulder injuries, and when finally forced to leave the field, he didn't go alone.
Derek Turner felt that it was about time he stopped me from doing this, so he clocked me, and down I went. And I think Lawler was the referee, Darcy Lawler, I think his name was. He said, Turner, you're off. And he says, and you're off too. I thought, oh, that's good. But as we were walking off, Derek wanted to have a go at me. He says, we'll finish this. I said, like hell we will. There's no way in the world I was going to finish that with him.
Elton Rasmussen was the goal kicker that day, but he did his hammy in this attempt at goal. Late in the second half, England had raced to a 17-13 lead. And then, what a climax. 2 minutes out, Ken Irvine races over out wide after a dubious Carson pass to bring Australia within a point of the tourists. Irvine needed this conversion of his own try to win the game. Kenny brought the crowd to its feet, his magnificent kick avoiding an Ashes whitewash. 1963 brought a hectic international schedule, and despite a poor showing in the interstate series, including a 53-7 flogging at Lang Park, Queenslanders performed well in the Test arena. Barry Muir and Bob Hagan were joined by Test new boys, Peter Gallagher from Brothers and West second rower Ken Day. Both had outstanding seasons, playing in all 5 domestic tests against the Kiwis and the South Africans. Unfortunately, the Maroons' poor interstate performance came back to haunt them when the Kangaroo side was announced. Only 5 locals got the nod. They were Johnny Gleeson, Barry Muir, Ken Day, Peter Gallagher and John Cleary. In the first test at the famous Wembley Stadium, some Reg Gasnier magic. We won 28-2. Going into the second test at Swinton, the Aussies knew they had a chance to create history and become the first Australian team to win the Ashes in Britain in 50 years. After so many near misses though, few would have anticipated what was to come. In one of the great displays of team rugby league, we slaughtered the Poms 50 points to 12, breaking countless records in the process.
Oh, and safe from the play of the ball. And it's a lovely pass. And away goes Langland. Nobody's going to catch him. Nobody's going to catch Langland. A beautiful dummy try. Oh, the overlap. And Kelly's going on his own and going on his own. Well, Kelly on his own. How simple can it be?
With the Ashes tucked under their belt, the Aussies could have been forgiven if they'd eased off in the third test, but with blokes like Barry Muir on the side, that was never going to happen. With infamous English referee Sergeant Major Clay giving the tourists the usual dose of rough justice, things reached boiling point following this incident with Muir. What followed is part of Queensland legend.
Anyway, as the play went on, the ball has scrum went down, the ball shot out. Tommy Smalls dived for it. The ball was on the ground. I kicked for the ball, and of course, I missed the ball and kicked Tommy. Tommy went down, and he fainted and complained that I kicked him where, and of course, Clay came over and just said off. And I said, oh, you've got to be kidding. I said, off. I said, what? Look at him. I said, there's nothing wrong with him. He's laughing. And I said, he's a pommy. Look at him, He said, off, Muir, off, and I said, oh, right. So I turned around and Kelly said, well, why don't you go and tell him to, you know what? I said, this could be the last time of anything. Well, I might as well give him a razzle-dazzle. So I said, Clay, I said, you can go and get, so
That was funny stuff. We may have lost that test, but we'd won the Ashes. The Aussie team might have been reaching the great heights, but things weren't looking so good for Queensland footy. The Pokies were generating big bucks down south, and we had blokes coming up here waving around open checkbooks. Already lost south of the border were stars like Noel Kelly, Elton Rasmussen, Ken Day and Kevin Ryan. Mick Vivers also jumped ship to head to my old club Manly, which even back then was coming up with new tricks to entice players.
I said, well, I have this South Sydney contract I'm going to sign. He said, well, don't tell us that. Well, look, we'll come up. I said, when? He said, tomorrow morning. So they flew to Coolangatta, jumped in a big black hire car, and they drove into these mountains up the back here when all the roads were gravel. There wasn't any bitumen in those days. And I can still remember that big black hire car coming down the road and Dad saying, watch these blokes, they could be shifty, they're from Sydney. They were all right, they were really good, and spoke about what was needed, what I wanted to do, and they said they'd go back and see the committee that night, which they did. He rang me at 9 o'clock that night, which was pretty late for me, but not for them. Said, yes, we're sending a contract, don't do anything with South Sydney.
Well, you only have to look at the record books to see the devastation that the player drain caused. New South Wales won 20 out of 21 matches from 1962 to 67, and things got so bad that some journalists proposed a State of Origin series, but it never got off the ground. The rich Sydney clubs refused to allow their players to go back and play for Queensland. The French side of 64, seen here being thrashed by Sydney 49 points to 2, failed dismally to live up to the expectations, and it wasn't until the Poms arrived 2 years later that we finally got top-quality international football in Australia. The 1966 first test in Sydney marked the beginning of Toowoomba tyro John McDonnell's international career. Also playing his one and only game for Australia was Angelo Creamer from Tully. It wasn't a great day for McDonnell, who badly injured a leg as Australia went down 17-13. With the Ashes on the line in the second test at Lang Park, selectors brought in Johnny Gleeson, John Wittenberg and Mick Vivers. The Queensland connection helped to stiffen the defence in what was a tough, sometimes violent match. The Aussies got home 6-4 thanks to Golden Boots Barnes.
With less than 4 minutes remaining, Australia leads 6-4. Joining in the play.
The deciding test in Sydney saw the emergence of one of the all-time legends of rugby league. He may have only played half the game, but in those 40 minutes, Arthur Beetson tore the Poms to shreds with some of the most incredible football ever seen. Artie was another one that got away, a Redcliffe boy poached by the South. It would be some 14 years later before he actually wore a Queensland jumper.
With Gars out of position, Beetson kicks for left winger Johnny King. Following on, King gathers and goes in for Australia's second try.
The match in 1966 wasn't without controversy. This, the third of the great Ken Irvine's 3 tries, had a hint of a knock-on about it, and check out Ned Kelly as he flattens Dave Robinson. At the final siren, the Aussies had prevailed 17-13 and the Ashes were retained.
The Aussies had really established themselves as world champs by then, Wally, and when the Kiwis arrived in 1967, they couldn't knock us off either. We gave them a hiding in the first test, and here, in the second test, they didn't do much better when they came to the cauldron.
Slick passing between second rower Thompson, 5'8" Gleeson, and finally Centre McDonald, and it's a try to Australia. Yeah.
Ned Kelly gave poor old Orchard a welcome to remember. Couldn't he put a bloke on his backside in a hurry?
Sure could, Fatty, and apparently he took a few early showers too.
And in those days, if you were a front rower or a hooker or something, you were expected to get cautioned and sent off, and you know, old fellas used to say, "Hey, you're not a bloody man till you're sent off, and you're not a man if you're not getting cautioned. Front rower's not doing his job," and all that was drilled into us, you know.
Well, as you can see, Paul, the game's probably a lot tamer now. And another big Queensland hit in that game was John McDonald, who fought back from that leg injury to play a starring role.
McDonald a personal total of 18 points.
So after disposing of the Kiwis in all 3 tests, it was time for the Kangaroos to head to England to really bury those Poms.
Yeah, that's right, Wal, but things didn't go according to plan. We went down here at Leeds 16-11 in the first test, losing 2 of our stars in the process, Johnny Raper, and that terrible moment that virtually ended the career of the mighty Gasnier when he broke his leg. With Billy Smith also out, our backs were to the wall going into the second test at White City. Selectors called on Queensland workhorse Peter Gallagher to lead the side into battle. And did he what? Gallagher, along with Coote, Johns, King and Langlands, were the stars in Australia's extraordinary effort in overcoming the odds to win 17-11 and level the series. What a moment for Pedro.
It was without doubt the highlight to captain your country and then to Ashes saving victory. It was something I'll never forget.
Arctic-like conditions prevailed for the decider at Swinton. Johnny Raper achieved the ultimate honour and led the side. Johnny Gleeson was a vastly underrated member of the team, and Australia suffered a huge setback when he was forced on the field with a smashed jaw. It was an epic struggle.
No score, Australia looking very strong. Peter Gallagher, this should be a try. And it's a try, a first try of the match, and a very good try.
The Aussies fearlessly threw themselves into every tackle to achieve a dramatic victory, 11 points to 3. Raper, wearing a corset for his injured back, was chaired from the field along with the injured Gasnier. Well, what an incredible tour, not to mention that infamous bowler hat incident.
Yeah, it was a great result, and Peter Gallagher, well, he was on a roll. That year, 1967, Pedro led his side Brothers to a grand final success over Norths. And the following year, under the coaching of the great Brian Davies, Brothers did it again in front of a record Lang Park crowd of 34,000.
And Morris is brought down by Kenning only a foot short of the line. It's the 4th tackle and momentarily eases the pressure on the Irish.
A young Des Morris was one of the few stars for East that day, but Brothers were all class.
A well-timed pass allows Monty to breach the defence, and he positions Maguire for a finishing effort. The winger outpaces Pine and Wackerley, and after a 60-yard sprint goes over for a spectacular try in the corner. The match is over, and from all parts of the arena, spectators invade the field to acclaim Brothers, who retain the premiership by 21-4.
Season 68, and in the New South Wales team that won the series 2-1 over Queensland were 4 Maroons: Beetson, Rasmussen, Wittenberg and Rhodes. We were beating ourselves. There was more talk of state of origin concepts, but it would still be 12 years off. Australia also staged its second World Cup tournament that year. Coached by Harry Barth, Australia were unbeaten, downing France 20-2 in the final meeting.
Through the backs, Beetson and Fournette sent Williamson over in the corner for the first try after 38 minutes.
It was a series forever etched in the minds of Innisfail's powerful winger Lionel Williamson.
Just everything went right for me. Everything went right. I was that excited, like you would have walked on broken glass that day. Everything I was just so excited with the whole thing, and it all clicked for me. I scored a couple of tries.
1969, and John Sattler led Australia on a rush tour to New Zealand, winning 1 test and losing the other. Norths won the Brisbane Grand Final, accounting for Valleys.
They finally break through as Massey goes over in the 27th minute. With the 4th tackle coming up, Fowler sends a long pass to Brown. On to Hall on the burst with Massey in support. Beating Wilson and Puskey, Paul sends Matassa flying for the corner, and he's in. Norths keep their line intact, and it's all over. Norths win 14-2.
And so to the 70s. Well, and this was it. An emotional Kev Kelly calling the first interstate match at the Ekka that year.
Yeah, and who could forget it? A depleted Maroons outfit up against the real legends of the sport. Our guys, well, they snatched a 16-15 lead right at the death, and thankfully they held on to win.
Poor old Kev, bless his soul, just lost it in the end, but this is radio folklore. Have a listen to this.
Queensland trying to storm the line. It's with Weiss. He dummies, trying hard to race through. Gets the ball away, ahead of Croft. Croft hurtling for the line, and he's been pulled down about 5 yards out. This is Queensland's chance. Shannon hurtling for the line. The ball to Morris, and he's over. Morris scores. And here's Stewart with a simple kick, which will put Queensland in front. Here's the kick, and it's there. And would you believe it? New South Wales at one stage led by 15 points to 7, and now Queensland have fought back tigerishly, and they lead by 16 to 15. 16 to 15 in favour of Queensland with time running out. And so it'll be a scrum. Can Queensland survive? 16 points to 15. New South Wales win the scrum. But the ball is finished with Queensland, and Queensland win! They've done it again. Queensland have humbled the mighty Blues. And I tell you something, it's great to be a Queenslander.
Now that was magic stuff, but Fatty, guess who Kev's co-commentator was that night? Peter Gallagher.
When I looked over and he was slumped in his chair with tears running down his face, and he was speechless. He was choked up with an emotion, and he handed the microphone to me, and he, out of a raspy voice, he said, "Take over, I can't carry on." Well, I did in a fashion.
Yeah, it was a night to remember, wasn't it? We didn't win too many in those days, and a young Des Morris can take a lot of the credit. He scored 2 tries.
But Fatty, on to more serious stuff. Frank Myler led the British Lions on tour that year. The first test was played in Brisbane, and what a bloodbath. Made famous, of course, by Cliff Watson's Liverpool kiss on Jim Morgan. Ron Lynch fractured his upper jaw. You talk about a bloody affair. But when it came down to the football, the Aussies simply whipped them 37-15. And one of the try scorers was John McDonald, who recalls the ferocity of that encounter.
It was a pretty fiercely contested match, that one, and certainly was no big pardons, and the stickers, as we refer to it, was on from the start, and I believe it was almost open warfare.
But that touring British side went on to shock us. They flogged us in the return bout, and in the third and deciding test in Sydney, Malcolm Reilly and a little bloke named Roger Millwood wrapped up the ashes for the Poms. And on the local scene, Valleys won the Brisbane Grand Final over Norse 13-11 in extra time.
Inside the 25, Gill goes the blind. On to Perkins. Back inside to Gill. Bursting through Lobergaga, he crosses for the equalising try. Clark's conversion attempt is right on line, and Valleys hit the front.
As you can see, Wal, interest in the Brisbane competition was sensational back then, and a grand final guaranteed a packed house. I was even there that day.
The season finished on a high for the Aussies as well, when they gained some form of revenge on the Poms by winning the World Cup in England 12-7. That was an incredibly violent match too. The following season, a lanky winger from Toowoomba named Wayne Bennett broke into the Queensland side, a player who would go on to make a massive contribution to the game. He even cracked a spot in the touring team to New Zealand, but wasn't a part of the test side that copped a flogging from the Kiwis at Carlaw Park. After the tour, the third interstate game was played, with a gallant Maroon side going down 17-15. Have a look at the crowd on hand. It really reflected Blues dominance. Barely a man and his dog turned up. The Brisbane Grand Final, played on a Sunday for the first time, again proved to be a highlight, with the dominant Valleys side of that era beating East 18-10. Valleys champion player Mick Retchless led by example.
Stepping wide of the marker, Retchless spears through to reach out and score under the posts. On for Maguire, Crilly to Retchless, who pots a field goal. Players show their appreciation of Mick Retchless's captaincy.
A disappointing Kiwi side came to town in 1972 with only one local Queenslander, West Wayne Stewart, making the Aussie side. He kicked 5 goals. North Sydney's George Ambram, originally from North Queensland, scored a couple of powerful tries and he won both games in a canter. That year will be remembered for one of the most exciting Brisbane Grand Finals of all time. A late try to Valleys levelled the scores at 15-all before Jeff Fife wobbled over a winning field goal.
He's hard on the attack. To Fife. A snap field goal almost as the final whistle blows. It's the first he's ever kicked and it gives the match to East 16 points to 15.
Scenes of pandemonium followed as the crowds invaded the field and the players, well, they didn't realise the match was over.
For Des Morris, it was a personal triumph. Earlier that year, he had been ruled out of a Queensland tour to New Zealand because of a supposed heart murmur.
Well, I was shattering, really, because, you don't get that many opportunities to play for Australia. And while I'd never been picked for Australia or I wouldn't know whether I was in the running even, that would probably have been my best chance.
Well, Des played up until 1981 and, he was one of Queensland's best ever forwards, but he never played for Australia. I think some doctors had something to do with that. You know a bit about that.
Yeah, don't remind me, fat man. My first club, Valleys, reasserted their dominance in '73, getting home 15-7 in the big one against Redcliffe.
Scanlon shows his class with a perfect dummy to Strudwick, then turns the ball inside to Gaylor, who spears through the confused defence to score Valley's second try.
Another great crowd of over 40,000 saw the action. The '73 Kangaroos saw only 2 Queenslanders selected, John Lang and Warren Orr. It came down to a third test decider on a frozen Warrington ground. Big Artie turned in a blinder as the Roos once again did us proud, regaining the Ashes. Barry Muir returned to the fray as Queensland coach in the season of 1974, and with him returned that special maroon spirit. Here's a try to Greg Vevers. We went down in that first game 22-13, thanks in no small part to former Queenslanders Artie Beetson and Lionel Williamson, who combined here for a try in the corner. Muir's men fought back though, snatching courageous draws in the last 2 games in Brisbane. We actually managed to get 4 players in the Aussie side to take on the touring Pommies: Warren Orr, Ray Higgs, Jeff Richardson and Johnny Lang. And in that first test at Lang Park, didn't they give the home fans a thrill? Richardson's great run setting up play before Higgs combines with Warren Orr for the game's only try.
And back inside to Coote, racing through the lock forward, tries to get it to there's Cronin in possession, back to Higgs. Back again to Warren Orr, Orr flies to the corner, and there's the first try of this test match. Warren Orr.
The Poms shocked us by taking out the second test, and our blokes were made the scapegoats as usual. Lang, Orr and Richardson all dropped for the decider. Some small consolation with former Queensland player Lionel Williamson playing a leading role in the last game.
Out to Beetson, keeping the ball alive to Williamson. Langlands is with him. Langlands going for the far line. Chesnell across, getting it to Williamson, who scores.
And Changa Langlands played a blinder to bring down the curtain on a fabulous career.
And the series won by Australia, and the jubilant captain coach Graham Langlands going out on top at the end of such a triumphant career.
Valleys completed their dominance of the Brisbane club scene with a tough trialist win over Brothers.
Strudwick.
Local legend Ross Strudwick kicking them to victory. The following season, 1975, saw Barry Muir's Maroons finally crack it for a win over New South Wales, breaking a 5-year drought. Muir had coined a nickname for the Blues which was to stick.
I was watching TV. I was showing the players one night a TV game between New South Wales and Queensland, and this bloody cockroach kept crawling on the TV, and it was always on the New South Wales side. It wouldn't be on the Queensland side, So I said to a few blokes, I said, "Look at the bloody cockroach." I said, "You wouldn't believe it." I said, "They are cockroaches, aren't they?" So anyway, when we were out training the next day in the Sydney Cricket Ground, I just said, let's get into these cockroaches, and it was sort of a motivational thing and get a bit of hate. Instead of calling them Gasnier or Langlands or, whoever it is, or Fulton, they're cockroaches. They're not human beings,
International games were dominated by the World Championship that year, with Queenslanders performing with distinction. Ross Strudwick's great form had been rewarded with a game against the Kiwis, and Johnny Rhodes, Lou Platts and Johnny Lang also played in this vital game against England at the SCG, which ended in a 10-all draw. The Aussies went on to be crowned champions in England. The local grand final that year was an absolute thriller. Wests held on to beat Redcliffe, who staged a late challenge. Pandemonium broke out when the siren went.
Look at the crowd running onto the field. This is stupid. The game's still in progress.
And down south, Big Artie cemented his rating as one of the all-time great forwards by leading Eastern Suburbs to their second successive premiership. 1976, and the Western Suburbs Panthers did it again, winning the premiership grand final by the unusual scoreline of 16 points to 1.
1977 brought a violent and hard-fought interstate series. Having been soundly beaten by the Blues the previous year, Queensland was full of fight, but so were the Southerners. Check out Tommy Raudonikis as he seeks out Greg Oliphant for some special treatment. Tommy's introduction that day really turned things around. New South Wales scored 2 late tries and beat us by 1 point. In a losing side, Greg Vivers was declared man of the match. That night, the victorious Blues captain Arthur Beetson was inexplicably dumped from the Australian side to tour New Zealand. The ARL refused to accept the team and instructed selectors to add Beetson. An unimpressed Artie refused his late inclusion, but later resumed the captaincy for our triumphant World Cup side. East had avenged their grand final loss to West in 1976 by taking out the premiership the following year against the luckless Redcliffe. And in 1978, the Tigers did it again against an up-and-coming Valley side. Club stalwarts Johnny Lang and Des Morris led from the front, with younger brother Rod also playing a big part.
Greg Holborn to Lindenberg, away goes Lindenberg, fires it back to Curry inside to Holborn towards the line to Roddy Morris, he's over!
Now, take a peek at this young, full-headed lock forward, and you guessed it, yeah, Wally the King Lewis, already learning how to communicate with referees.
Valley's 8, he's 7, critical stage of the game, 12 minutes of play gone second half. Wally Lewis is away, puts the kick in, a race for the ball, a try! No.
Oh, he was pushed going for the ball, and Lewis is saying, I was pushed, sir. And he was pushed badly.
Well, you couldn't help yourself even then, you lunatic.
Well, I didn't mind having a bit of a chat, but, you know, I took the consequences and I knew all about it. But you didn't mind a bit of a yak yourself. I mean, just 7 days prior to that, you scored a try out there. I mean, it was a great try, but I've been listening to that for the last 17 or 18 years. You're telling me it was the greatest try you've ever seen.
Do you want to hear about it again?
No, no more. I've had a gutful of it.
Well, you were down here in the blind. Waving to me. I ran 80 yards.
We were going to get in the grand final anyway. What was the use of pulling you up? Give you a little bit of a pat in the back. You grabbed a Toyota out of it or something, did you?
Yeah, $200. ANZ Try of the Year. Terrific. Now, have a look at this North Queensland wonder boy. Innisfail's 18-year-old Kerry Bousted carving them up in a Queensland selection trial that same year. His rise to fame was meteoric, to say the least. Debuting a month later for Australia in the 1978 Test against the Kiwis, and what an impact he made.
It was a fantastic day. I believe it was in Lang Park, and it was against New Zealand. And I actually was fortunate that day, got a few opportunities and scored 3 tries. And so got man of the match. So I had quite a day, and from then on I was very confident in what I did.
The selection of the Kangaroos in 1978 caused a hell of a hullabaloo up here when only 3 Queensland players made the squad. Johnny Lang was considered extremely unlucky, as was Test second rower Greg Vivers. Bowie continued his rise to the top, scoring a try in the Aussies' first Test victory in Wigan.
Lovely to crane it out to Boosted, could go close, he does, and he makes the odd yard, and that's a great bit of play.
The Poms got us in the second Test, but we won the decider and took home the Ashes.
As usual, our superstar Kerry Bousted was lost to those Southerners in 1979, the big spending East securing his signature. Queenslanders were seething.
Despite losing all 3 interstate games in 1979, several youngsters were emerging who would go on to be top players. Mal Meninga, Chris Close and Colin Scott, amongst others, were all blooded in that series. Little did they know they would soon be part of a football revolution called State of Origin, spearheaded by the late, great Senator Ron McAuliffe. The QRL chairman was determined to make it happen, but more on that a bit later. At that time in rugby league, a youngster from Wide Bay was making a huge impact on the game. His name, Mal Meninga, and he too had to contend with some offers from down south.
All I know at the moment is that East have written a letter to the QRL and to have a talk with me. but nothing will be finalised till after the grand final.
The big policeman decided to stay put with the Magpies, and King, weren't you there when Valleys won the premiership that year?
Yes, and loved every minute of it when we beat South 26-0.
McQuirter to Lewis. Lewis put in a little kick, regathered, still going. Kellaway's at him. He got away from Kellaway. Sends it back to McQuirter, and he'll race away, and he's over underneath the post.
Also that year, a weak Pommy side toured, and we smacked their backsides 3-blot. And you know something? Not one Queensland representative was selected in the entire Australian side. Sure, there were plenty of expats there, but they were all playing for Sydney clubs. One of them was the Rockhampton Rocket, Rod Reddy, who had a brilliant tour of England the previous year and was again in superb form in 1979.
Reddy, sights an opening, Reddy, going for the corner.
In 1980, Smokin' Joe Kilroy was the man of the match in North's thrilling 17-15 win over Souths in the Brisbane Grand Final.
Have a look at Kilroy, defenders everywhere, and he just goes straight between the lot of them. Phelan misses him, Astle dives at him and misses him, then he had Big Brian Dunn outside him, and the giant centre just streamed away.
So in 1981, the French came to town, and I don't reckon they sent their rugby league side. The girl guides came out, because in the 2 tests, Australia notched up 60 points and the French 5, and you made your test debut that year.
Paul, they were very ordinary, no doubt about that, but still a very proud day for me at the SCG. My dad watching, a debut's a very proud day for anybody watching the game. But Paul McCabe, he was the real star of the day, I thought. He was a young fella, had just switched to the Sydney East Club.
And what a grand final that year. Paul Redcliffe were beaten on the bell by a point. And guess who was involved in the match-winning try? None other than Mal Meninga.
The following year, and a premiership at last for the Seagulls. Coached by Des Morris, Winner Manly won the big one, downing South 17-3. Brother Rod Morris came out of retirement for this one.
Bullock will send it across to Rod Morris. Morris almost through, back to North, it's away! Yes! Half-back is in, underneath the post.
Oh! Rodney Morris, and there's Des. Des is pretty happy now.
And what a year for you, Wally. Your super form against the Kiwis that year helped you attain further glory when you were picked as vice-captain for the 82 Kangaroos.
Yeah, but that moment quickly soured. I got dropped for the first test and couldn't get a start until the second, and that was off the bench. Big Mal made his Kangaroo debut as well and frightened the life out of a few of those Poms. He was a prolific point scorer.
Oh, it's a good high ball. Here's a chance, Mal Meninga. Oh, what power, what size.
We came home undefeated and will be tagged the Invincibles. In 1983, the Graham Lowe-coached Kiwis came to Lang Park after losing the first test at Carlaw Park. I think our approach was too casual because the Kiwis recorded a stunning 19-12 victory. That match ended Arthur Beatson's Australian coaching career. And at home, East beat the luckless Redcliffe in the premiership decider 14-6. The Lions tour of 1984 provided much better contests than in 79. I took over the captaincy role and Australia clean swept the series. Redcliffe's Mark Murray shared in the spoils in the first test. The Maroons were well represented. Miles, Canescu, Dowling and Niebling all contributed to our success that day.
Yeah, Wally, you really were on fire that year. First, you led combined Brisbane to victory over Eastern Suburbs in the National Panasonic Cup.
On to Miles, and the big international centre is in to score. There's the siren, it's over. Brisbane have won it. Brisbane have won the cup final.
And then you came home and led your Winner Manly side to a competition success over Souths.
Yes, and there were more stars than in heaven playing at Lang Park that day. In our side, we had Gary Coyne, Greg Dowling, Gene Miles and the French brothers, while Souths, coached by Wayne Bennett, had Mal Meninga, Gary Belcher, Bob Lindner and Peter Jackson. But it wasn't enough. We were simply too classy on the day, winning 42-8, the biggest ever grand final winning margin.
Lewis, the long one. Brian Walsh into the back line, then away to Terry Butler. Butler back inside. This is Lewis. Lewis got away then to Miles, and Miles was in. And it was Green able to stand up and get away then to Dawes. Dawes back inside to Lewis. Lewis crashing through. Here's another one.
The following year, Senator Ron McAuliffe stepped down after 15 years at the helm of the QRL. His blind passion for Queensland Rugby League is recognised as the reason the Maroons had scaled so many heights. In the shake-up that followed, Ross Livermore was appointed Managing Director and Chief Executive.
When I started here, he said, you can
virtually do anything that's in the interest of the game. He said, even if you might tell a few little white lies, I'll back you to the hilt. But he said, if you touch the Peter, you're dead set straight out the door. And I always live by that philosophy, particularly when you see, or not so much now, but in a few years, clubs go to the wall, the treasurer's taken the money, or the books of account aren't there. The old story about the chequebook in one pocket and the receipt book in the other.
1985 also produced an unforgettable rugby league moment in the first test against the Kiwis.
Well, he's pointed off. Tamati and Dowling have gone off in the sin bin for 10 minutes. And Tamati, well, he's got a smile on his face, and they're still arguing as they go out the door. Dowling is giving him a shove. The fingers are going. They might carry this on in the shower room. Dowling's, and it's on again. It's on again. Dowling gave him one, and Tamati came back, and this is disgusting. Really, they're fighting now right in front of the crowd off the field of play.
I'm sure Kevin Tamati won't forget it in a hurry. It wasn't the only controversy involving Greg Dowling that year. Unbelievably, Test coach Terry Fernley dropped 4 Queenslanders, including GD, from a winning side for the third Test. The result was an 18-0 thrashing by the Kiwis.
Gets it to Kevin Tamati. They get it on, they're going to score. Over the post, the Kiwis have gone in.
Senator Ron was far from impressed.
One good thing comes out of this, though. You can bet your bottom dollar that on July 23, out here at Lang Park, those 4 fellows will give a superhuman effort for Queensland to prove to Terry Fernley that he was wrong in his judgment, and they'll throw his words right down his throat again.
At the end of the season, Souths gained sweet revenge on Wynnum in one of the greatest defensive exhibitions of all time. The Glamour boys from Wynnum could find no way through as the Magpies got home 10-8 in a tight one.
Fullback Belcher's underneath it, and Belcher takes it, and very well done, Belcher. Gets away from a lot of them. Cullen's pass out to French. French sends it on to Elias. Elias starting to move now. Running strong. Look at John Elias over the quarter line. The pass comes back inside now to Norm Carr. Gets up off the ground. Carr, can he keep going? He got the ball down. Norm Carr, yes he did. It's a try to Norm Carr, and the Magpies lead.
Wynnum Manly returned with a bang the following year, annihilating a hapless Brothers side with King Wally the captain coach.
French away from the tackle of Bomber. French for the line, slips it back inside. Lewis onto it. Play on. Lewis for the line. Lewis stretches out. It's a try. It's a try to Wynnum Manly. Switches it across to Jenner. Jenner in the gap. Back inside for Scott Lewis. Leaves it behind. On it goes to Mal Green. Slips it to Attell. Attell for a try line in the corner.
For the club that had been down the bottom for so long, it was the last hurrah of a marvellous era which will live long in the memory of its hardy supporters. So in 1986, while you and I had mixed fortunes when the Kangaroo Tour was announced, I mean, they left me out, and why they picked you, I've got no idea.
Well, I thought I was a half a chance of getting in. I was the current captain, but it was my greatest honour in rugby league. I mean, it was a situation to lead the Kangaroos in a test series overseas. Magnificent if I got the chance to do it. Finally got that, but there were a couple of wobbly decisions. Not just saying it and doing it in your pocket here, but you were very unlucky to lose out on that tour. Most people had you down as a certainty. When the squad was announced, you were missing from it. And a lot of people, and I probably agreed to them, that it was almost a bartering deal between selectors that kept you out of the team.
I remember the Poms gave you a tough fight in the last test.
Now Australia under pressure. Watkinson, Gregory, Pinner, Marler, Goodway, Crooks out to Stevenson, inside to Schofield. It's a magic try for the Great Britain side. It's out on the quarter, 10 metres in from the sideline. Strikes it. It's there. So, for the first time in the series, with the breeze at their back, we've got a scoreline that's locked at 12-all. 18 points to 15. There's Roy Simmons running around behind the defence. Got it to Wally Lewis. Wally throws a dummy, another dummy, and Lewis has gone under the post. An incredible solo try.
In 1987, a club with great tradition but financial problems took out the title when Brothers downed Redcliffe. It was the Dolphins' 6th grand final loss since their last win in 1965.
Whoops, he's made a mess of it, and Brothers all scored. John McGraw.
By now, though, it's fair to say that most attention was directed towards the impending arrival of the Broncos. As season 1988 arrived, it was a time of great sadness with the passing of Ron McAuliffe. Tributes poured in for the man who had done so much for the game in Queensland.
That same year, an improved British team arrived. In the vital first test, which was the centenary Anglo-Australian encounter, 4 Queenslanders made their test debuts: Jackson, Belcher, Bacco and Curry, and they proved to be the difference in a tight struggle.
Oh, he's only a metre out. So Australia, where are the big men? Borton still going. Borton unloads back to Backo. Backo heading for the line. Hit him, no one meet him. Oh, good stuff, both sides. Fullerton Smith gets it under Sterling. Yes, Jackson's in. Oh, yes, Sterling with a beautiful pass to Jackson.
After the Poms left, it was time to take on New Zealand in the World Cup final at Eden Park. And in front of 46,000 screaming fans, I tried to play with a broken arm, but in the end, it was little Alfie that proved the difference.
Back to O'Connor. They get it on to Shearer. Shearer stepping. Here's Langer. Langer with a chance if he can step it out. Langer heads for the corner. And what about that? Langer's done it again with a great...
But around this time, interest in the Brisbane competition really fell away as the Broncos grabbed the limelight. But that didn't stop Queenslanders coming through and making a huge mark on the international scene.
In '89, Australia proved too strong against the Kiwis in a 3-test series played in New Zealand. I was on fire, fair dinkum, helping set up this try for Dale Shearer. Just brilliant. You too, Rowdy. The same year, Big Mal led Canberra to their first title. In 1990, Australia was off to England, and the Poms were much more competitive. They'd won the first test, and just when it looked like we were finally going to lose the Ashes, Big Chicken George finished off this heart-stopping break by Ricky Stewart.
Almost no time left in the match. Stewart, here it comes now to Lindner. We're well into injury time. 40 seconds, in fact, as it comes away to Stewart again. Stewart throws the dummy. Now Ricky Stewart's on his own. He's up to the halfway. He's waiting for Eddinghausen. He's got support. Eddinghausen's with him. Back it goes to Meninga. And Meninga scores. Oh, what a try. What a try. What a right from Stewart. And what a try. Meninga.
Magic stuff. The crowds were back in force when Gary Schofield's team arrived in 1992. Mal Meninga led Australia to victory in the first test.
Jackson now, short ball and a good one. Great hands, Meninga. Beautiful play from Wishart. Meninga again, still travelling. Meninga gets it in. Gillespie, he won't have the pace, but he gets it. Jackson, Meninga started it. Meninga will finish it.
31,000 turned up at Princes Park in Melbourne, where the Poms shocked everyone by giving us an absolute hammering in the second test.
Stedman! Unbelievable! The Ashes will be on the line.
In the decider at Lang Park, Reg Gasnier, the greatest centre of all, was on hand to congratulate Big Mal on breaking his record for most test appearances.
Will be trying to
the big fella played a huge part as well, as we held on to win the Ashes in a thriller, 16-10.
Incredibly important set of 6. Daly wide. Meninga, great pickup. Meninga, does he get a try? What great strength.
1994 saw Mal off on his record 4th Kangaroo Tour. In the second test, he found himself in familiar territory, bursting upfield following an intercept. This time he was the provider, setting up ET for the vital try.
Gilding across, intercepted by Meninga. The big bloke's away. Offier's after him. Eddinghausen's coming in support. Meninga, he's running out of legs. He finds Eddinghausen. He scores.
The Ashes were on the line for the third test. Steve, the oldest of Ipswich's champion Walters brothers, showed unbelievable determination.
He's got it! Steve Walters!
As Australia went on to a brilliant win.
Well, that's the incredible Queensland story so far, and we've been privileged to be a part of it.
Well, that's right, Wally. I mean, you and I have been so proud to have been born in Queensland, raised in Queensland, and played rugby league for this great state and pull on that maroon jumper. The good news is the Queensland story will continue. It will go on and on and on, no doubt about it. I'll tell you what, Wally.
It's great to be a Queenslander.